Hi, I'm Selectman Bill McDevitt, and welcome to another edition of All About Town. We haven't done one of these for a while, and I know that some of you have been enjoying, maybe too frequently, the video that we did on the walk with Paul Gagnon through the conservation land. But it's fall, and here we are again. This subject is a little more serious. Maybe 6, 7, 8, 9 years ago, we had a lot of discussion in town about arsenic in well water. Now, don't reach for the remote, because I think you're going to want to hear some of what our special guest has to say, and we're also going to look at a video that has very interesting information. So today we're going to talk about arsenic in well water, particularly in Pelham, not just in other parts of the state, but this may affect you and your family, so it's really important to stay tuned and listen to what our guest has to say. I think you'll enjoy it. You'll find it very informative, and hopefully it will cause you to take some action. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Mark Borsuk, who is coming to us from the Thayer School. I'm going to read from my cheat sheet of engineering at Dartmouth. He has an extremely impressive resume, but most importantly, I have to say he has degrees in civil engineering, statistics, and environmental science and policy. But right now, he's working with Dartmouth Superfund Research Program and New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services to study and overcome the obstacles to keep homeowners in New Hampshire from having their well water tested and treated. So, welcome, Dr. Mark Borsuk. May I call you Mark?
You can call me Mark, please.
Okay, fine.
Yeah, great.
So tell me a little bit about, or tell our visitors and viewers a little bit about yourself.
Sure. As you mentioned, I'm at Dartmouth in the School of Engineering, and I've been working together with the Dartmouth Superfund Research Program. This is a program that you may be familiar with. You may have heard the term Superfund program because of the cleanup activities that the EPA and the National Institute of Health have done around the country to clean up contaminated sites. They also support basic research. And so the Dartmouth Superfund Research Program is one of multiple sites throughout the country that are receiving support to undertake research related to environmental contaminants and human health. So this program at Dartmouth has been in place close to 20 years and has continued to receive support to undertake research in these related areas. Our focus is on toxic metals, and so arsenic and mercury are the two metals in particular. And we study everything from sources through to effects of these metals. And so we have projects that look at mercury in the aquatic environment, in ecosystems, waters, estuaries, and such. We also have researchers who are looking at the human health impacts, and we have researchers who are looking at the impacts on young children of exposure to arsenic, even as early as in the womb. And so part of this project is to connect with communities around these issues to help both inform the communities and inform ourselves about how our research could be made more relevant to the work they're doing. And so through this larger program at Dartmouth, we are working in cooperation with the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services to, as you mentioned, understand why people aren't testing their water to the degree that we think they should, given the potential risks. And what are those barriers, and how could we overcome them? And so we've been working with NHDES over the past 2 years now on this project. Excellent.
Well, we hope that this is yet another way to reach the members of the public. We're going to take a little break while we introduce a video called In Small Doses. It's about 10 minutes. I think you'll find it very interesting, very informative. And when the video is over, Mark and I will be back to explore some of the issues the video brings up a little more in depth, but also as they apply to us here in town, because they certainly do. So here's the video, and we'll be back at its conclusion.
Arsenic has been known be acutely toxic for millennia. If you take it at 700 parts per million in the water, then it will certainly kill you moderately quickly. But what was not known until fairly recently is continuous use of very low doses can be very bad. And that means continuous is daily ingestion. You know, arsenic's a very common element in the Earth's crust. It's a number 20 or something like that. And the question is, how do you get it inside? And it's coming mostly through water.
The reason that's important, for example, in New England is maybe 1/4 of all the people's wells in New England have levels of arsenic that we might think of as not being safe.
We have estimated that about 2.3 million people in New England use private wells as their source of drinking water. And in some states, like Maine and New Hampshire, that's about 40% of the population.
New Hampshire law does not require water testing at private homes, nor quantity requirements at private wells.
Low-dose arsenic exposure has been associated with skin cancer, bladder cancer, particularly in smokers, and possibly lung cancer.
That's why it's particularly important for private homeowners with wells to test their wells periodically and to take action to protect their family. In 2001, EPA revised their drinking water standard for arsenic to 10 parts per billion. And that was done after many months and years of extensive testing and research.
The drinking water standard in the United States for the levels that we used to think were safe was 50 parts per billion, which sounds like a really tiny number, and it is. It's 50 micrograms, which is a millionth of a gram, for every liter of water. So it's a really, really tiny amount. And yet, we now know from epidemiology studies that that level is not safe, that if you drink that level for a lifetime, your disease risk is pretty substantial.
With the previous arsenic drinking water standard of 50 parts per billion, it was thought that the cancer risk was as high as 1 in 100, meaning 1 in 100 people drinking arsenic at 50 parts per billion would develop cancer.
Normally for man-made contaminants, the acceptable risk rate for pesticides, herbicides, fuels, industrial solvents is 1 in a million.
We now have laboratory studies and some emerging epidemiology studies that suggest that 10 is not safe either, that we're seeing health effects at as low as 10 parts per billion.
So we're really interested in looking at these low levels and what's happening. So sort of asking the question of how low is low enough for an appropriate drinking water standard.
Overwhelmingly, the evidence that we have suggests that the arsenic we see in groundwater originates from natural sources in the minerals in the rocks of the region. Apparently, there's two main factors that control whether arsenic ends up in your groundwater, and that's having some arsenic in the rocks as a source, but also having the right geochemical conditions. And in New Hampshire, that equates to having water that's relatively high pH and water with relatively little dissolved oxygen. Those two factors together result in high arsenic concentrations in water.
In the world today, in Asia alone, about 100 to 120 million people suffer from arsenic-related illnesses.
How arsenic causes disease is the big $64,000 question. Nobody really knows the answer to this. What we do know is that arsenic doesn't behave like any other chemical that we know.
My research focuses on the effects of low-dose arsenic exposure on the immune system, particularly the immune system within the lung. What we've done is we've developed a mouse model in which we expose mice to arsenic in their drinking water at 100 parts per billion for 5 weeks. 100 parts per billion is not an uncommon level of arsenic to find in areas of New England, such as New Hampshire and Maine. Following that exposure, we infected the mice with a sublethal dose of influenza A, an H1N1 strain of flu. And what we found was that the mice exposed to arsenic had an increased susceptibility to infection, and they also had an increased severity of infection, resulting in a severe morbidity observed in those arsenic-exposed mice. In theory, there would be a dose threshold in which we would expect no effects for arsenic exposure. The problem is that we don't really understand what that dose would be. We've certainly seen effects following arsenic exposure at 10 ppb or even lower.
In my laboratory, we've seen effects on endocrine disruption and some other endpoints that we measure at below 1 part per billion. So now we're talking about parts per trillion, which is a hard number to even think about.
The question remains as to whether or not these effects are biological effects or toxicological effects, meaning do they have an adverse outcome on human health or not.
And so the issue is one to educate the homeowner on in terms of the importance of having a comprehensive water quality test.
I go to the state, I get a little decanter free, and the tests cost $10 to $15.
The liquid is sprayed into the instrument and it goes into the inductively coupled plasma, which is a hot ionized gas. It's 7,000 degrees, which is hotter than the surface of the sun. So the sample basically is desolvated, you lose all the water, and the molecules are broken up into the chemical elements. And those elements are extracted into the mass spectrometer, and then the mass spectrometer basically counts the atoms of any particular element. So we determine the element by its unique mass, and we count the number of atoms in that sample. And that's how they determine concentration.
It takes maybe 2 weeks to get the results back. It's a pretty easy process, in and out. There are various ways to remediate arsenic, and they're pretty inexpensive for a household like ours.
There are 2 different sizes of water treatment devices. One is called whole house and would deal with approximately 200 gallons of water each day. The other is called point of use and would only deal with the water that one would consume each day.
It's not thought that dermal exposure, such as you would get in the shower, is such an immediate concern when compared to ingestion through the drinking water.
We actually got ours at Sears and had a plumber come and put it in underneath the sink. So I think you can put them in yourself, though.
At the USGS in New Hampshire, our primary responsibility is to provide impartial science information on the nation's water resources. We know from our studies that certain parts of the state have 30% of wells where we see arsenic concentrations exceeding 10. By zooming in and looking more closely at specific geology, we see some places where every other well has arsenic greater than 10.
If arsenic is in a city water supply, the city takes care of it, generally, and at least tells you if there's a problem. If you have your own water in your own well, the city doesn't have to do that. So, in fact, it's your own responsibility to take care and figure out what that arsenic concentration is.
So really the bottom line is that everybody has to test their well. There's no predictive power. It doesn't matter whether your neighbor does or doesn't have arsenic. Each well is individual and has to be tested individually.
Welcome back, and here we are with our guest, Dr. Mark Borsuk from Dartmouth. And so we all had a chance, Mark, to look at this video, understand its message, but I would like to understand better, how does that apply to us here in town? I mean, we saw some pictures that I saw in the credits were from Bangladesh and so on and so forth. Why should we worry about that, and why should people watching this video worry about those things?
Sure, yeah, that's a good question, because you see some of these more scary acute effects, and you wonder, why don't we see those kinds of things here if arsenic is a concern? A lot of what we know about arsenic is because of, unfortunately, these higher concentration areas in the world, and so that we know it can be a toxic metal. We don't have those kinds of concentrations here, so we don't see those types of acute effects. Nevertheless, from that kind of red flag, researchers have been looking at other potential effects of arsenic at lower concentrations. And so arsenic, as you may know, is naturally occurring in the bedrock of New Hampshire and other parts of the country, but in the granite rocks of New Hampshire. And so when someone has a well that is drilled down into the bedrock, there's the potential for arsenic coming naturally from the rocks and to come into the well water.
And we have a lot of those drilled wells. We don't have.
We have a lot of drilled wells.
Yeah,
That's the other
we don't
thing.
have a lot of dug wells in town.
No, that's right. No, we don't have a lot of dug wells, and
Yeah.
a large percentage of the population is on their own private well water.
Yes.
And so that's why it's a particular risk here in town.
And I want to touch on the fact, just for our viewers, that we do have, by my very rough estimate, 6, 7, 8% on a quote public water system.
That's
It's
right.
Pennachuck, which really isn't public because the town doesn't own it.
Right.
But let's digress for a second.
Sure.
What about people who are on Pennachuck? Do they have
Sure.
to worry about this?
So Pennachuck is called a public water system because it's at the scale at which it's providing water to the public. It's privately owned, as you mentioned, but it's subject to the rules that any other public water system are subject to, which means that they have to undergo regular testing and they have to meet particular guidelines that are set by the EPA. And so in the case of arsenic, it's 10 parts per billion. Parts per billion may sound like a small amount.
Doesn't sound like much.
No, it
Not at
doesn't.
all.
But unfortunately, something like arsenic or many other contaminants at those concentrations can have an effect. So the EPA has set what's called a maximum contaminant level of 10 parts per billion for public water systems. And so Pennachuck, together with the other public water systems, have to regularly test their water and report to its constituents if it exceeds those limits. While those of people on private water, myself included, aren't immune to those contaminants, we bear the responsibility of making sure that our own water is safe. The EPA and the town don't have any responsibility. in that
I think
regard.
that's a critical point, not so much who's responsible
Yeah.
is the viewer who has a private well.
Yeah. They're responsible. It's
They're
only
responsible.
the onus is completely on them to make sure that their water is safe. There's some information that may be conveyed at the point of a real estate transaction, but it's a situation where the buyer has to be aware, have their water tested, and have it tested again regularly, even after that original purchase, to make sure that it doesn't include arsenic at significant levels or other contaminants. So we can't feel like the town or anyone else is protecting us against these contaminants when we have our own private well system.
So I had interrupted you. We were talking about different kinds of wells and dug wells
Sure.
and so on and so forth. Now, so some wells in town are very, very deep,
Right.
and we have a stratified drift aquifer. That's
Right.
a nice technical term I like to use once in a while, whenever I can. A big, sort of slow-moving lake that runs
Sure.
through
It's a great source of water,
right, the
generally.
center of town. If I'm into that, am I still subject to arsenic?
Sure, yeah. So we have a map here behind us, and what you can see, what this map is showing, this is a study that was done by the USGS, the U.S. Geological Survey. And what they did was they collected water samples in a large number of locations around the state, in fact, and many other parts around the country. And then they developed a kind of statistical model that said, based on the concentrations we're finding in these wells, can we try to interpolate, that is, try to draw a map of the whole state and assess what, in general, our best estimate is of people's
Sampling,
risk.
in
sampling.
layman's term, sampling.
It's sampling, right,
Yeah.
exactly, and then building a kind of statistical model. So what this is showing are a map of New Hampshire with the town boundaries in gray, and the darker colored areas, in a kind of dark orange, have a higher probability of having arsenic concentrations above 10 parts per billion. This is what the EPA has set as a maximum contaminant level for public water systems. And so you can see with Pelham being here in the southeast, it's within a swath of area that's in this darker color. And that's precisely because of the nature of the geology in the area. Areas to the south, or to the north, I should say, aren't
Hardly any.
Hardly any.
Want to get
And
way
it's
up.
just simply
Yep.
because of the geography. It's nothing that they've done differently in terms of, in general, how they locate their wells. So yes, digging wells or drilling wells into bedrock is what starts to raise the concern. Shallow wells, dug wells, don't have this concern because they're not in contact.
We don't
with
have a
bedrock.
lot of them.
They may have other concerns. It's not to say that people shouldn't still be concerned about the safety of their water, but it tends to be other things like bacteria.
Not likely arsenic.
Not likely arsenic.
So we were talking a minute ago about the video and the scenes from Bangladesh.
Right.
There are some folks watching who might say, look, I'm only going to live here 5 or 6 or 8 years.
Right.
And what are the short-term effects and
good
long-term effects?
Right.
And can I just blow this off and say, look, I'm not drinking this stuff for 40 years.
Right.
I'll be fine.
Right. No, that's a good question. The acute types of effects that one may hear of that occurred in Bangladesh, for example, are from higher concentrations, and they're acute. By acute, we mean things that come on over a relatively short term and that have fairly significant health effects that are detectable.
All right, so their parts per billion is way higher than
it's
10.
Hundreds of parts per billion.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Even 1,000 parts per
Okay.
billion. And so we have much lower concentrations. As you know, we're talking about threshold levels of 10 parts per billion. It can be higher than that, above 100 even in some areas. But nevertheless, those are far lower concentrations. And so these are what are referred to as chronic effects. And just as you highlighted, it means the effects that we see, and this is largely things like bladder cancer, lung cancer, certain types of skin cancer, potentially some heart health effects. These are things that result from long-term exposure to these lower concentrations. And so if you were to live here and drink the water for 4 or 5 years, chances are you wouldn't be seeing these effects, and it likely over the course of your lifetime wouldn't be significant relative to the many other health risks that we're subject to on a daily basis. But if we do drink water on a regular basis, we live in a home for a longer period of time, and especially if we have children, or as children, if we've grown up in that home drinking the water, children are with their lower body weight tend to be more susceptible because the water they're drinking has a higher per body weight type of concentration. So it's a long-term effect, and that's, to be honest with you, part of the problem. You don't see symptoms on yourself.
That's my next question. What do I look for?
Yeah, what do you look for?
And
it's typically a kind of elusive, because anytime someone is diagnosed with cancer, it's very difficult to point to the particular cause.
Yes, okay.
And so the risks that we're avoiding are often, we don't have the ability to come back and say, boy, aren't I glad I treated my water because I don't have cancer, or to say, on the other hand, if you are diagnosed, unfortunately, with one of these forms of bladder cancer, you won't be able to point to that. As you know, some of the types of cancer I mentioned, lung cancer, bladder cancer, are there's many other causes of those, smoking being a predominant one.
And there's really no way
to parse it out. No, there's no marker. There's no particular indicator. But that's not to say it's not a risk. And so the risk is significant enough that I think it should be of concern for the reasons you mentioned. There's a fairly large number of wells here in town.
Absolutely.
Concentrations can be high relative to other parts of New Hampshire and other parts of the country. And many of the residents who we've been polling, we did a survey to get an understanding of why people do or don't test. Many residents have been living in their home for a long time. And even if you have, I'd encourage people not to hide, put their head in the sand against it.
Well, it occurs to me as you're talking, if I approach the average person on the street and said, if I put some arsenic in your well, will you drink the water?
Right.
And I know the answer is going to be, no way.
Yeah.
No way am I drinking that water. So if you push all the scientific things aside and just say, would you drink it? No.
Yeah.
So the question is, let's find out whether we're drinking it.
That's right.
Or not.
That's right. So not knowing is, I think, you're answering that question automatically. You're saying you're drinking the water, and you're doing it perhaps unwillingly.
Now let me get you into the long-term effects,
Sure.
and I warned you of this question. I know some people in town who are 90 years old.
Right.
Okay, born and raised here,
Yeah.
and one I know drinks water out of a well that I think is down under the kitchen sink someplace. That's a dug well.
That's a dug. Okay.
But these folks haven't. In fact, the ones I'm thinking of are all alive.
They're alive, right?
Okay?
Yeah.
And they haven't been diagnosed with arsenic poisoning. Is that just good luck?
It's good luck. I mean, it's the risk level isn't high enough that everybody who drinks levels of arsenic, these levels of arsenic in their water for their lifetime will would be diagnosed with cancer. It's you could think of it as, a rough rule of thumb would be something on the order of talking about the levels of the concentrations of arsenic we might see in this region. Roughly, maybe 1 out of every 200 to 400 people over the course of their lifetime may end up getting one of these forms of cancer as a result, and not all of them are fatal, terminal cancers. So, it's certainly not a large fraction of the population, and just like any other risk, it's not something that hits everybody. It's something I tell my students, it's when I teach a course in decision making under risk and uncertainty, and risk is something that is a result of uncertainty, and it's something that we could try to make decisions in light of, but making those decisions isn't going to influence the role of chance or luck. And so either way, you could take action and still have one of these negative consequences, or you could not take action and not have a negative consequence. But that doesn't mean at a population level it's not potentially impactful.
So let's go from that to, okay, people at home are watching this, and you're very credible, and they're convinced.
Sure.
Maybe I should test my water.
Great.
What's the step? What do you do?
Oh, it's easy.
Now what? Because is it going to cost me $500?
No, it certainly won't. Test the water. It won't. So there's a number of private labs around the state that will test your water.
Okay.
You want to make sure that they're certified labs so that they have the appropriate testing equipment and can report the results to you in a credible and understandable way. And there's a number of them throughout the state.
Okay.
And also the state health lab in the Department of Health and Human Services, the public health lab can test your water for you.
Okay.
Now, what you would need to do is go to the website that'll be shown on the screen.
Okay,
here.
we're going to run the little.
Great. Go to that website and you'll find a list of the state certified labs, as well as the state lab. And what you'll need to do is contact them. You can there's web forms in many of them. So if you're watching this late at night, you could submit your request. And they'll send you a kit. And we'd like to recommend that people do what's called a standard or a standard analysis, which includes a suite of different possible contaminants.
That was my next question.
Yeah,
is it just an arsenic test? Or
there's just an arsenic test, and it costs at the state lab. It costs $15 for just an arsenic test.
Okay.
And so they'll send you a bottle. You'll need to go to your tap and follow the instructions on that. It's going to likely require you running the water for a minute or two to kind of clear the system and collecting a sample,
Okay.
and then sending it in. And it's $15, and then you'll get a nice report that tells you what your level is, how that compares to the levels of potential concern. Now, because if you haven't tested for arsenic before, chances are you may not have tested for other contaminants. So while you're doing it, it might be a good opportunity to test for other things. Bacteria could also be a concern.
Okay.
Also, uranium might be a concern in some water. If you end up having either any of these as a potential levels of concern, the type of treatment that you would be needing to get would depend upon some other factors of the water, like hardness, iron content, pH, and those in a standard lab, a standard suite, it would include those elements as well.
Okay.
So that costs $85 to do that
that's
fuller suite.
By the way, one thing I want to interrupt and say to people watching at home. If you bought a new house in town, in Pelham, since August 6th of 2013, we require, prior to getting a certificate of occupancy, that you have your well water tested. So if you have a new house since August of 2013, you should have, you can't move into the house unless the water is tested and you know what's in it. Right. But most of the people watching would be prior to that. I just want to mention that.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
And I would be remiss if I didn't mention radon as well. Radon is, because it's a somewhat more involved test, is an additional $80 beyond the others. And again, you'd probably, if you've never had your water tested and you wanted to feel safe with all the kind of contaminants of concern, because radon is a concern, again, for the same kinds of reasons, the contact with the bedrock, it would be a good idea to get a radon test as well.
So I do a test, either just an arsenic test or a more broad spectrum test, or include a radon. Let's concentrate only on the arsenic for the moment. Sure. I get a test back, and let's take the good scenario that says, you're fine.
Yeah.
Okay? Should I do it again next year and the year after?
That's a good question.
Is this a
Well, first of all, I want to make sure it's clear that it's not going to be an up or down kind of an indicator.
You have
tell
it or
you
you
your
don't, not
level,
yes or no.
and then
Okay.
you have to use some judgment as to
Okay.
whether to be concerned or not. And so I mentioned the state, the EPA's MCL, we call it the maximum contaminant level, is 10 parts per billion, and that's based more upon a recognition that the costs of treating water at levels below that exceed the benefits that would come from that when we talk about public water
Okay.
systems.
Okay.
And so for a private well owner, if you have particular concern, may decide that even at levels below 10, you might still want to take some action on that.
Okay.
And so you shouldn't necessarily feel like just because it's below 10, you can scratch it off your list of things to
Well, I get,
think about.
with this report that I get, will it just give me that number?
It'll give you
and-
that number, and it'll remind you of this 10 parts per billion level.
Okay.
And it'll probably give you some information, depending on which lab you get it from. It may give you some additional information about what this means in terms of how far above or below this level of concern might be relative to other well water in the state.
How do I get it out?
Out.
What do I do? How do I get the
Oh,
arsenic
yeah, good
out?
question.
It
But
comes back
before,
and it says
real
you've got-
quickly, I want to get back to your earlier question
Yeah,
because
go
I don't
ahead.
want to overlook
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
In any case, it's recommended that people have their water tested about every 3 to 5 years.
Oh, 3 to 5.
And so
Okay.
you don't have to do it again next year.
Okay.
But if there's no arsenic, that would indicate below a detection limit. You might want to go more on the 5-year
Okay.
time frame. If it's something that's starting to show detectable levels, you might want to do it every 3
I might be
years.
concerned about the direction of those tests.
Exactly. You might be concerned about the direction of the test. And
Okay.
while your well might not change over that period, the source of the water, meaning below ground, may slightly change as the water flows. It's in
Okay.
contact with
Yep.
different rock. And
Yep.
so that's a good time period. Not because there's anything inherent about that with respect to the geology, but because you'd want to be on top of it at approximately that interval. And so coming back to your question then about what do we do about it. So there's
Yeah,
a
what do we
number
do
of
now?
effective treatment systems in place. Fortunately, arsenic is a contaminant that only presents a risk through ingestion, meaning if we drink it or consume it in some way.
If I shower in it,
If you
and
shower
I
in
know
it,
this
it's
is on
not
the
a
video,
problem.
but we should, showering is not a problem.
Shower's not a concern. Watering
Inhaling
your
the
lawn,
steam or anything
nothing
like
like
that?
steam or anything. No, it's
I water my vegetables.
Yep,
with
no,
it?
don't have to worry about that either. It's going to be through direct ingestion. I guess if you were watering your vegetables, if you had a particularly high concentration in your water, and you were using that well water directly to water your vegetables, and you were regularly eating the produce from your garden, it may be you'd want to have treated water for your vegetables or rainwater or something.
Okay.
But in general, it's through ingestion. So what that means is the treatment is going to be what's referred to as point of use, meaning that you would likely install a treatment system that only needed to treat the water that was coming through the tap that you regularly drink from. For most of us that's a kitchen tap. And so that saves you a lot of expense and saves the trouble of what would be called a whole house system, meaning you're treating all the water.
point
that's
of
coming-
entry system.
Point of use,
Yeah,
point of
point of
entry
entry,
system,
yeah,
point of
yeah.
entry. And for things like radon, that might be more important, but for arsenic, it's typically a point of use. And so there's a variety of different treatment systems. I would recommend you consult with your listeners or watchers consult with a treatment professional on that. One of the things we have learned from our survey is that people who try to do it as a kind of do-it-yourself system, maybe going to Home Depot or something.
Yes, that would be-
getting a system.
yeah.
Tend to either not quite know what they're getting into to the extent of exactly how often the filters need regular replacement, and probably only a water treatment professional can help guide you as to how frequently that needs to be done. And the type of treatment system you get is dependent upon your particular water chemistry. I mentioned that earlier. When people get a standard test, they'll get measures of some of the other elements in the water that may play a role in how you treat arsenic, things like iron, pH, and hardness and such. So it's best to consult with a water treatment professional. I should mention, as part of this project that we've been doing with the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, their role in the project has been to develop a web tool so that anyone who has their water tested, you'll get the results, and then you could go to this web tool and enter in your results, and it'll give you some personalized guidance as to what type of treatment system might be best for you,
Okay.
and could help you identify a water treatment professional to provide that system.
So if I search on New
It's
Hampshire...
Be Well Informed. We have the catchy name, Be Well Informed.
Informed.
And so if you look for New Hampshire, you probably just New Hampshire and Be Well Informed, or better yet, maybe NHDES.
Okay.
You Google that and Be Well
Okay.
Informed. This is a tool that's coming on live just as we speak.
So
And
I have my test result.
and yep,
I can look at that.
and it'll give you some guidance as to
Some
what
guidance.
treatment system.
Okay.
It can be a bit overwhelming at first, and this was one of the ways we wanted to address this, is to say, all right, there's tools out there to help you, so that even before you go and contact a water treatment professional, you'll go into that conversation informed, and then you can ask the right questions and know that you're getting a system that is the right one for you.
The scary question, I guess, and I don't know if you know the answer. What's a typical system cost?
Sure, that is a good
And
question.
people at home are thinking, well, boy, this is nice, but
There's no one typical system per se. There's a variety of systems, as I say, but I think one should expect to pay on the order of $300 to $800 or $900 for the system. And again, depending on the water chemistry, you'll have to replace the filter, and that can be, if there's high arsenic levels, it may be doing it more than once per year. Like if there's lower levels, and again, depending on the water chemistry, may only be once a year. And those filters are unfortunately a little expensive. They're close to $100 themselves. So
Okay.
it's a sustained investment. But when you think about our health, I think it's an investment worth making.
one of the questions on my list, which I didn't ask you, but I think I know the answer. What about my dog, my cat, my goldfish?
Yeah.
Am I safe with that?
There's no reason to think that they would be immune to these concerns. They're generally less long-lived, and so they won't accumulate it.
The likelihood of anything showing up in their lifetime is much.
Yeah, I would say you shouldn't probably get these treatment systems only for your dog or your cat. But,
Okay.
But chances are you're drinking the water yourself.
Well, you're probably getting it from the tap.
Yeah. I guess maybe the answer to your question is, if you have the treatment system in place, ultimately, then you might as well give the dog or cat the treated water as well.
Okay. I have a son-in-law and daughter who have a treatment system because arsenic was identified in their well years ago.
Good.
And I think it's just point of use.
Yep.
It's at the kitchen sink.
Yep.
And it seems to work very well. They
Yep.
changed the filters and so on
Great.
and so forth. So
Yep. Yep.
I don't know what they paid for it. But
And what people should also know is that when we think about water treatment, we may think of a variety of different types of treatment, not only for arsenic, but people have water softeners at home, or they have Brita filters and a variety of other types of filters. Not all of them would remove arsenic. In particular,
that's a good question. If I have a Brita
water
filter-
softeners don't.
All right.
And so if you have a water softener, you shouldn't feel that that's taking care of the arsenic in your household. That's for the purposes of removing the hardness in the water.
It adds something,
Yeah.
or it
Yeah.
doesn't
filter out the
filter.
arsenic.
So some people have these Brita filters on their water. Do we know, does that remove arsenic?
We're not quite sure of that yet. It's you might think it would. It's a activated carbon filter, and that can be useful in removing arsenic. It's something that we're still looking into, and so for the time being, I would say to do a little bit more looking into that.
Okay.
You probably get information on Brita.
Okay, they should
in that regard.
go to Brita.
Yeah, and then of course another option is drinking bottled water, and it's probably worth mentioning that if you get test results back, and there shows that there's levels of concern of arsenic or anything else, don't panic, and you don't want to have to hurry to install the treatment system. What you would want to do is perhaps switch to bottled water and take your time, find the treatment system that's going to work for you, and then probably in the long term, cost effectively, point of use treatment system is going to be the right way to go. But don't feel like suddenly you've got to move out or that you've got to.
It's not a crisis situation.
It's not a crisis situation.
It's not immediate public health hazard.
It's not an immediate public health
Okay,
hazard. You
okay.
won't face acute consequences or anything. Again, it's a long-term risk, like many other long-term risks that you should take precaution against, but you don't have to panic.
One of the things I wanted to ask you before we wrap up was also about, we talked about long-term, short-term. There's folks sitting at home and are thinking, I'm planning on selling my house.
Yeah.
Do I have to tell someone? Do I have to test it? I guess if I test it and I know there's arsenic, I'm under a legal obligation to say so. But
so in this part of the state, in this part of the country, people are aware of this as an issue and typically would want to have it tested.
If I was as a buyer,
as a buyer,
I
and
might
so you
wanna
probably
say-
should be prepared that a buyer is going to want to have the water
All right.
tested. And so my suggestion would be being proactive in an area like this where we know that it's a concern, being proactive by telling a potential buyer that either you've had it tested and it's not a concern, or you've had it tested and have taken the proper precautions such that they can move in with full confidence that they're drinking clean water, is a better way to go than to avoid it entirely.
Okay, good answer. I heard a rumor that you're doing some other things in town.
We are, yeah.
Okay,
so we're excited. Our next
here's your
phase of
opening.
some of the work, yeah. So we're fortunate in working with some partners in Maine to get a grant from the US EPA, so that we work as partners between New Hampshire and Maine on an educational program around arsenic and groundwater. And so this will support work that we're doing in from our part in New Hampshire with some high school science programs. And so we're working with the Pelham High School here. We're just getting it started, and so we're in the stages of planning with them. But what we have planned so far is developing a curriculum around which the students could understand a concern like arsenic and other related types of concerns, and then actually gain some kind of field experience or real-world practice, both in collecting the relevant data and analyzing those data for patterns and trends. And so what this program would consist of is sending the students home with the well water testing kit, having them collect a sample. They would send it to us at Dartmouth. We would be doing the analysis as part of our Superfund program. We have a trace elements core, and they have a core meaning a facility that runs these tests. And then we would be sending them the results back, and they could connect with students in other high schools, even around the region. Maine, arsenic happens to be a concern in groundwater in Maine as well. And they can share their experiences, perhaps produce some plots, some maps to see trends and patterns. And if it's a concern, then raise that with their families. What we suspect based on previous studies is that families with children tend to listen to those children when they raise concerns.
Absolutely.
Or what you might have had kids come home and tell you to recycle, and if they're the ones reminding you, it tends to spur action more than hearing about it from some know-it-all like me.
I stopped smoking about 40 years ago because my kids
Your
were
kids told
hounding
you
me.
too. Good.
Okay?
Well, maybe we can get the kids of Pelham to remind their parents to get their well water tested.
That's really good advice. So, Mark, what else is going on in town?
I'm glad you asked, because we actually have been working with, as I mentioned earlier, a number of towns throughout New Hampshire, and Pelham has been one of our partner towns. And so this summer, our community engagement coordinator, Catherine Lawler, was here twice trying to connect with people. It's doing something we called an Intercept event that is reaching people as they go about their daily lives, to not distract them from what they're out to do, but to talk to them in a setting where we might reach people that we might not otherwise reach, and let them know about this as a potential concern. So this summer, Catherine was at Pelham Plaza talking with people, and also at the library. Some people have
seen her already.
So some people may have seen her already, and maybe even gotten some of our information. We also have postcards that have been distributed to residents of the town, and our informational flyer has been posted on the town website as well. And so, again, this may be familiar, and we hope that this is today can serve as a kind of reminder of some of that. If you saw Catherine and you got her postcard, maybe this can be a reminder
we'll do some
follow up on
finger wagging right here on the video.
That's right.
If you got the postcard and you saw Catherine and you talked to her and you haven't had
you
your
promised her
water
you would
tested,
test your water. Yep.
Now's a good reminder.
Yeah. Okay. And I should also mention that the Community Health Institute is working with us on this. They're a professional public health communications group, and they've had an office here in New Hampshire for a number of years, associated with the John Snow Institute, and they have been great partners on this in terms of preparing our materials. So the nice glossy graphics and everything, you see that they've been helping us put those together and run a lot of these Intercept campaigns.
I think I'd like to thank you very much. This has been really informative.
Oh, I hope so.
I enjoyed it, frankly, and
I don't want to scare anybody with this.
No,
again.
Sometimes there's messages that are important to get out, and I think people listening are people we care about in this community, and we care about their health, and we know that they care about themselves and their families. So the opportunity to check the water, find out what it is, don't panic, and then do something about it. I think this has been terrific. Before I thank you, I also want to thank Catherine Lawler, who
Nice.
helped to put this all together.
Great. She's our
Also-
community engagement coordinator,
And
and
she
so as
has-
part of our project, we're reaching out to communities. Catherine's the point person on the high school education program, and has been really the point person on this effort with what we've been doing with Pelham and the other towns around the state.
We give lots of credit here on,
Good.
on this program. We don't give anything else, but we give lots of credit.
And I shouldn't neglect either Lori Raridan, who's our research translation coordinator. Her responsibility is getting the results of our science out to the public. And so Catherine's responsibility primarily is to hear the concerns of the public and bring them into our program. Lori's is kind of the other direction around. She gets the results out. And so she's also been working closely with us on issues of communication and preparing our materials and such. And Bruce Stanton is the principal investigator of our Superfund program. And so Dartmouth Toxic Metals program, as I said, it's been going for a
Okay.
while. People can get more information by going to our website. We have a page dedicated to arsenic, which provides a number of other resources and links for folks, including, if you want to share the video, the In Small Doses video,
Sure.
it can be available there as well.
Okay, well, this has been great. So I want to
Thanks,
thank
Bill.
Mark Borsuk for coming all the way from way up north, the Connecticut River
Yeah, from the
Valley.
Connecticut River Valley.
But thank you
Good.
very
Happy
much
to
for
be
coming
here.
down. I appreciate it.
Good,
It's
thanks,
nice
Bill. I
to
enjoyed
have
it.
you. And